Hello everyone and welcome back to the Football Insider channel. I am Conor Bromley and today we are talking about the transfer window, and specifically we are talking about Newcastle United and whether or not they had a good window or not. If you enjoy this video, please leave a like and subscribe, and also leave your comments about Newcastle's transfer window and whether or not they had a good one, a bad one, or somewhere in the middle. So I think the first place to start really with this is, what did Newcastle actually need to do heading into the window? And this is before the summer started. This was where they were at the end of last season. They get into the Champions League and they needed to bring in a striker to replace Callum Wilson. They needed backup for Alexander Isak. They needed a right winger to come in. They hadn't really replaced Miguel Almiron. They needed an upgrade there. Jacob Murphy's obviously done very, very well, but they needed somebody in there. I think they also probably needed a centre-back as well, and a goalkeeper. So they were the four areas I think Newcastle and their fans were looking at in particular and thinking, these are the areas we need to upgrade and add in some top quality players. You've also got to remember that Newcastle have struggled really to add first team players to the squad. Not really since Sandro Tonali came in a couple of years ago had Newcastle brought in a proper, genuine first team player. So it was clear that Newcastle had work to do heading into the summer, but it looked like they'd sort of ridden that PSR storm. They'd come out the other side and they were going to be able to spend big this summer and really make the squad very competitive for the top end of the Premier League and for the Champions League. So I think really the question overall for this video is did they actually do that this window? And obviously there's a lot of mitigating factors. We're going to go through all the things that happened this window for Newcastle. But I think overall they did actually tick pretty much all these boxes. Now, whether or not you agree with the quality of these players compared to the ones that they had, that's, up for debate. But they did actually tick the boxes when it come to these signings. So overall, what did they do in terms of transfers? Well, ins, which I'll put on the screen, but I'll read them out as well. Nick Woltemade came in from Stuttgart for 85 million euros. That's a club record deal. Anthony Elanga came in from Nottingham Forest for 61 million euros. Woltemade Wissa came in from Brentford for 57 million euros. Jacob Ramsey came in from Villa for 45 million euros. Malick Thiaw came in from AC Milan for 35 million euros. And they also loaned in Aaron Ramsdale. And then the outgoings, of course, the big one, Alexander Isak, he went out for 145 million euros. Lloyd Kelly went to Juventus. That was a loan deal from the second half of last season, but that went through this summer for 17 million euros. Sean Longstaff went to Leeds for 13.8 million euros. They lost Dubravka to Burnley, Wilson to West Ham, and they also loaned out Matt Targett on loan. So they were the main incomings and outgoings for Newcastle. So let's start with the Isak situation. And this was horrific, really, for all parties, because I think the club and the player didn't handle this situation correctly. Isak was very unprofessional with how he dealt with this, refusing to train, refusing to play, injuries and all that sort of stuff. The statement that he put out, they are all negatives. I mean, they are things that footballers shouldn't do. They're professionals, they're contracted by clubs, that shouldn't happen. But I also think Newcastle did not handle the situation well, in the sense that I think it was pretty obvious, judging from reports, that Isak had been unhappy at Newcastle and had let the club know that he wanted to move away towards the end of last season. And that being said, if that is the case, Newcastle probably should have been very proactive in selling Isak to Liverpool, since they were interested, and trying to get that deal done much earlier in the window, because that would have helped them out massively in terms of buying in players. And also, it looked to me like there was an element of panic buying with the players that they did bring in, but we'll talk about that when we get to them. So I think that this is a really horrific situation for all parties. I think Newcastle probably would have benefited from getting this resolved earlier. I think obviously Isak and Liverpool, they would have preferred this done earlier. And the fact it's stretched to deadline day, I think, is a shame, because Newcastle, if they got this done early, would have benefited from that. And it felt like at times they were cutting the nose off to spite their face. To keep Isak, they were pretty regiment that they wanted him to stay and that they were going to keep him pretty much against his own will. Is that a smart move? I would argue probably not. And what we ended up with was a long saga that eventually ended on deadline day. And that isn't really helpful for Newcastle, especially because they were trying to do business at the end of the window. So Newcastle's replacements for Isak, we know they needed at least one striker in, but they ended up with two, obviously, to replace Isak. And I think they overpaid for both, if we're being brutally honest. Woltemade comes in from Stuttgart, but he was a free transfer last summer. He had a really good season last year, but that's a risky signing. He's a player that is very raw, has a lot of growing room. He's probably at a good place to do that. Eddie Howe's got a really good record of developing players, but this is a club record transfer fee, and I don't know if this player is necessarily in that upper echelons of players. I mean, the sort of money that they've paid for him, that would suggest that this guy's ready-made to score 15 Premier League goals. I don't know if that's true. And then Wissa, proven in the Premier League, no doubt about that, had a really good career at Brentford, but he's in his late 20s. They started with £25 million. That's what they tried to get him for at the start of the window. They end up paying over 50 million. So it's really quite startling how that deal's went up. And that to me was a panic. Newcastle needed that deal done. Brentford digging their heels in a little bit, and we ended up with an inflated fee. I don't think the Wissa is worth 55 million, but Newcastle had to do them, and it ticks boxes for them. They probably don't care that they've overpaid because they did do really well on the Isak sale, but it's hard to look at Isak, who's a top 5 striker in Europe. They've replaced him with Wissa and Woltemade, who for me are not going to be in the realms of being top 5 players in Europe anytime soon. So maybe their depth is better. Wilson obviously has had injury issues, had a really poor season last season, so maybe they've improved their overall depth there, but they obviously have lost a world-class striker and haven't brought in a world-class striker. Let's talk about the other rivals though. Elanga, Ramsey and Thiaw tackle issues within the team from last season. And Newcastle have got a top winger in Elanga. He was really impressive at Nottingham Forest. He's a fantastic transition, counter-attacking player. Newcastle quite like to play like that. I think he'll do very, very well, particularly away from home when Newcastle maybe are camped in a little bit more defensively. And it's someone to push Murphy as well. And Murphy's been fantastic for Newcastle. He's been incredible since Eddie Howe's come in. However, is he a top 5 winger in the league? Probably not. Elanga can be a top 5 winger in the league. So I think that's a really, really good get for Newcastle. Somebody they got in early, and I was impressed by that business. Ramsey comes in. He's a young-ish central midfielder, proven Premier League midfielder. Is an upgrade on Sean Longstaff, no doubt. And he's also, he's got the potential to push ahead of Newcastle's already pretty strong midfield. They've obviously got Joelinton and Bruno and Tonali in there. And I think Ramsey really, really helps to elevate that midfield and put real competition on those ahead of him. So I think that's a really, really good bit of business. And Thiaw's a player that Newcastle have tracked for a long time. They've tried to get him before. He's a good young player. He's a little bit raw. I don't think he's as polished as he needs to be. But Eddie Howe, being the manager there, he will certainly help sort that out. So I think Thiaw is a good bit of business for that money. It's not often you sign a player of his ability for around 35 million euros. So that was good business. And I think as well, you look at the X factor for all this is Eddie Howe as a coach. He's so good at developing players and so good at getting the best out of them. And Newcastle have brought in some rough diamonds this summer. I think Elanga could do with some polishing. I think Thiaw can do with polishing. I think that Woltemade can do with polishing as well. And those 3 players, I think, will improve under Howe. They've also obviously brought in Aaron Ramsdale as well to back up Nick Pope, and potentially he could take that number 1 shirt. He obviously knows Eddie Howe from his time at Bournemouth. So let's look at the overall Newcastle depth chart. I'll put that on the screen right now. And I think it looks pretty healthy, in all honesty. Goalkeeping-wise, they've got Pope and Ramsdale, 2 very steady Premier League goalkeepers. Are they elite top level? Maybe not, but they are certainly serviceable in the Premier League. At left-back, Burn Hall. At centre-back, you got Thiaw, Botman, Shaw and Lascelles. I've just kind of put, I don't know how Newcastle necessarily playing, so I've just put them as centre-backs there, the 4 of them. And that's pretty strong. I think, obviously, they could probably do with another centre-back there long-term. Lascelles is 5th choice if Burn's playing at centre-back as well, so Burn can also play in at centre-back. Right-back, they've got Livramento, they've got Trippier, they've got Kraft, who's clinging on to his Newcastle position, so they're pretty well stocked at right-back. In midfield, Tonali, Willock, Joelinton, Ramsey, Bruno, Miley. They've got really, really strong central midfield options, so that's good. That's as good as pretty much any team in the Premier League, other than maybe the top sort of 2 or 3. And then the forward line, you've got Gordon, Barnes, Wissa, Woltemade, Asula, Elanga, Murphy. I do think Newcastle don't look as strong losing Isak, losing that diamond up there, and it'll be interesting to see how they adjust to that. But I think Newcastle overall are pretty well covered all over the park, and they've addressed a lot of their issues in terms of depth compared to last season. So with having all the extra games of the Champions League, that's a massive plus. Are they better overall? It is really hard to say that when you've lost a player of Isak's ability. And I think Newcastle fans probably are really happy with the business, but are obviously disappointed that they've lost a player of Isak's ability. So overall, I'd probably give it a 7 out of 10. I think Newcastle had a pretty strong window. The Isak saga clouded it, but now we're past that. We can look at this and go, do you know what? Overall, they've actually done pretty well. They've ticked a lot of boxes. They've been able to get in the players that they've needed. Yes, losing a player like Isak is horrific for them, but it probably helps them in the long term. PSR room and all that sort of, glorious stuff we see in football. So I think Newcastle can be happy. I think Eddie Howe probably is happy right now with the business that Newcastle's done, and it gives them a chance to compete on all fronts. I think that squad depth has improved this season. So anyway, let me know what you think of Newcastle's transfer window in the comments below. Please like and subscribe as well, and we'll catch you for another transfer window review very soon.